Welcome to our Wheel and Anchor webinar on the Elbe River from Berlin to Prague. This is a program we're going to be doing in next year in September. Very excited about this program. If you've just joined us, so how this webinar works is that I'll be doing all the talking. For those of you that have met me in person, you know how much I love to do the talking. But I love to hear the feedback from you and any questions as we go along. So if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, there is a button marked chat. And if you click on that button, if you have a question at any time during the webinar, I'll try to address it right at that time, or in the worst cases, I'll save the questions until our question and answer opportunity, which is right at the end of the webinar. So we'll get started then. Welcome to everybody who's joined us. I'm not going to rhyme off all the names. We'll, without further ado, we'll get going. So just to give you a bit of an overview, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, or perhaps have not joined a webinar or attended one of our events in the last several weeks, Wheel and Anchor is about bringing travelers together. And so I have a commitment with this organization that we started a little over a year ago to bring like-minded travelers from all across Canada to enjoy trips to some interesting and out-of-the-way places around the world, as well as to events in Canada, much like the ones that I have been doing over the last few weeks, particularly the last week and a half here in Western Canada in Ontario. And of course, we're going to eventually cover the whole country, or as much of it as I can possibly manage. So that's what our philosophy here is at Wheel and Anchor. So the vision of Wheel and Anchor. So my vision for you as our members is to be well-traveled and well-connected. So what does that mean? Well, if you are somebody that's well-traveled, you've been out in the world, you've experienced all kinds of different cultures, you've met different people, you've tasted different cuisine. It just gives you a whole different perspective on life here in Canada, and life when we look out and we open the newspaper or we open our iPads to read about news in other parts of the world. It just gives us a greater understanding into the world at large and to humanity, and that to me is a very important attribute, and something that as human beings we have a great luxury to be able to be well-traveled. And of course, being well-connected is really about meeting other people, both from here in Canada, other people who have a similar view on travel and understanding and learning about all the things, all the peoples of the world, but also getting to know people in other countries as well, because I say that gives us a greater context for sort of life on the planet, as it were, in a broader sense of the word. And joining us on our webinar this morning, our team. So myself, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Gordon Dreger. I'm the founder of Wheel and Anchor. Also on our webinar this morning is Joel Curry, who is my co-founder and is providing our technical support. So if anything goes wrong, we just blame Joel, or we hope that he's going to fix it. And Cassandra McKinnon, who is our senior member services specialist. Cassandra is actually not on the webinar this morning for a change. She is en route back from hosting a group, our women's wellness group, which is just on their way back from Austria. So because of the timing of this, Cassandra couldn't join us this morning, but that's okay. She's here in spirit, and of course, always there for anybody if you do have any questions along the way. The plan for today is it's already all about you. So you as a traveler, you've obviously you have some interest, some curiosity about this river called the Elbe. It's not nearly as well known as like the Danube or the Rhine. So you want to find out a little bit more what it's all about, what it's like to cruise down this river. I'm here to be your guide and to be your fellow explorer. I've explored much of this region myself before on actually numerous occasions. In fact, I used to live in Prague, but I'll tell you about that a little bit later. And the subject of our inquiry and of course the destination is the Elbe River, and Prague and Berlin, the two capital cities that we're going to visit on this journey, as well as the many other places along the way. So let's get started then, and let's get a sort of an overview map just to give you a sense about the Elbe, because as I say, it's really not too well known. It's not one of the rivers that I remember studying in geography class back in high school. But the Elbe is actually the fourth largest river in Europe. And so we often think of the number one or number two when it comes to geographical features, but we don't usually often think of number four. And the Elbe River, a very important river, which flows out of the Kürkonosche Mountains in the northern part of Czech Republic, close to the border to Poland. And it flows south down through the western part of Czech, then over the border, and then it flows in a northwesterly direction out into the North Sea near Hamburg. So it's a very important river. There's a lot of history to it, and we'll see that in the various towns and cities that we're going to be visiting along the way. An interesting fact as well is that part of the Elbe River actually used to be the border between East and West Germany. So it had quite a politically significant role during that time when the Iron Curtain was in place in Europe. So taking a look at a little bit more detailed map of our program, we start off, of course, in Berlin, the capital of Germany, and a city that's not been on a lot of people's tourist maps, right? People think when you go to Europe, you think of London, Paris, Rome. You think perhaps of Munich and Oktoberfest or Vienna, and Berlin. Perhaps because it was situated off as a sort of an isolated city for so many years, hasn't been on many tourist maps. I can tell you it is one of the most dynamic cities in Europe. Anyway, more about that later. We're going to start in Berlin with a couple of days before embarking on our ship, which will take us out of the canals and lakes that connect into as tributaries to the Elbe River. Which we will join near Magdeburg, and then continue down upstream through all these towns in the eastern part of Germany, crossing the border into the Czech Republic and the beautiful mountains there before culminating the cruise in Prague. And then, of course, we have an extension program available to Karlovy Vary. So that is the overall map of the itinerary. And now I'll take you through the program day by day and just give you a few of the highlights that you can expect along the way. We leave Canada on September the 7th. And for those of you who are coming from Toronto or let's say eastern part of Canada, we have a direct flight available from Toronto to Berlin. It is on Air Canada Rouge, so I'll let you render your own judgments about that, but there are other routings available. If you're certainly coming from the west, from Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, we'd fly you via Munich or Frankfurt in all likelihood, or perhaps even London, Reykjavik. There are a number of different options to get you over to Europe. And of course, we'll arrive the next day then in Berlin on the 8th of September. Berlin, well, it's a terrific city. I first visited Berlin back in 1985, so quite a long time ago. And they refer to Berlin as the gray city, which is a little bit strange in a way because the city is quite colorful. But I think the reason that they call it the gray city is actually more because of the weather. Being situated inland and close to the North Sea, which kind of often casts cloudy weather on a lot of the cities from the Benelux countries all the way through northern Germany. But I can assure you it's actually a very colorful city. And there's an interesting thing to know, or perhaps what tells the most about the overall impression of Berlin is that its size. In terms of geographical area, it's 9 times the size of Paris. Yet Paris, as I think is commonly known, has over 10 million inhabitants, whereas Berlin has a third of that, 3.5 million. So that gives the city a very spacious and airy feel to it. There's lots of parks, tree-lined boulevards, canals, waterways. It has, I think, more lakes, more water surface than any other city in Europe. It really is quite a remarkable place. When we arrive into Berlin, we're going to take a panoramic tour that's going to allow us to see the location of some of the most important sites, like the Reichstag, which is the German Parliament buildings, and Brandenburg Gate, the famous Kurfürstendamm, which is the shopping street in the former western side of Germany. It also houses the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, which is a very interesting architectural feature sitting on one end of the Kudamm. We'll see the Victory Column. There's so many different things to see in Berlin. You'll feel like you barely had enough time to capture the city. But nevertheless, that's why we've allowed for a couple of nights at the beginning, because that way you can take in some of the many things that there are to do here. So the following day, our first full day in Berlin, will be completely at leisure. And why did I do this? And this is really part of the philosophy of Wheel and Anchor, because one thing that we find is that people find they don't have enough time just to explore on their own. And Berlin is a very easy city to get around. We're actually going to give you a welcome card that is going to enable you to make use of the transit system. The transit system is actually larger than even the one in London, so it takes you everywhere in the city. And it allows you to go around and see places like the Brandenburg Gate, or perhaps 400 museums that exist in the city. There's a museum for just about everything under the sun, or just really wandering around the streets. When I go to Berlin, I like to just wander around, because there's so much that is fascinating there. But let's talk a little bit about one of the most important symbols, which is the Brandenburg Gate. We're going to see it on our panoramic tour, and then I'll encourage you to go back. In fact, I'll probably bring a few of you back. And the Brandenburg Gate is really the symbol of Eastern and Western Germany. The wall, it was actually in the middle of the no man's land back during the whole period where the Berlin Wall separated the city. And I can remember when I was there back in 1985, and it was still a divided city, and peering out at this incredible monument that was practically derelict, because, as I say, it was in a part of the space between the eastern and western side of the wall where nobody could go. And as a result, it was practically falling down. And yet, on recent trips to Berlin, there's a beautiful hotel just on the other side of the gate from where you can see the picture here. And I remember enjoying a little Aperol Spritz, a common cocktail in Europe, while looking out at the Brandenburg Gate and all of the people who came to admire this symbol, which is not only the division of Berlin, or the division of Germany between East and West, but it was really the symbol of the whole Iron Curtain that separated Eastern and Western Europe for so many years. So quite an important symbol, one of many that we'll see. So after we spend a day at leisure, we're then going to get picked up and brought to the Elbe Princess. That'll be on the 10th of September. So we'll have 2 nights in Berlin to enjoy the city. We'll actually have the morning of the September the 10th free as well. We'll then, before we get on the ship though, we'll do a tour that's called the Cold War in Berlin Wall Tour. And this is one of my favorite tours. It's a little bit grim in the sense of you really get to witness the sobering reality of what the city of Berlin and the whole country went through from all those years between 1961 and 1989 when the wall was in place. The wall, as many of you know, was 150 kilometers long. It split the entire city in half, separating the so-called Russian zone from the zone of the Allies, the French, the English, and the Americans. Before the wall was put up to try to stop the millions of people that were emigrating the communist dictatorship that was emerging in Eastern Germany. And so they put up this wall, and it literally cut off the flood of people that was traveling from east to west overnight. Even so, 100,000 people tried to escape over the wall. Many of them were successful, but several hundred were unfortunately lost their lives in the process. And we'll hear all about that when we visit Checkpoint Charlie in the museum that's there. It's really a sobering reminder of all those years of separation and the Berlin Wall. While most of the city, if people ask me about seeing the Berlin Wall, there's very few places where it's still standing. They have some sites where they've kept it up as a memorial, but for the most part, there's only sort of a golden brick path that shows you where the wall used to go through the city. So if you look down on the streets where the wall used to be, you'll know where it was. But for the most part, you don't even know that it was there anymore. And that's what I think is the amazing thing, that they have truly reunited the city in a remarkable way over the last 30 years. And as it's noted there, it's the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and yet you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know that it's there. So later that afternoon is when we get on board our ship, the Elbe Princess. This is a beautiful vessel. She was only launched in 2016, so she's quite new. And I want to tell you a little bit about her because she's quite special. And in fact, this whole program is special because it is the only river cruise ship that can sail between the center of Berlin and the center of Prague. And that's because the Elbe is a notoriously shallow river. And as you'll see from the photo at the back, this vessel is, the Elbe Princess is propelled by paddle wheels. And it's necessary because the traditional form of propulsion with the propellers underneath would be simply too deep to navigate the river. So they've come up with this solution, which makes it a little bit nostalgic in a way. The ship is also smaller than your average river cruise ship in Europe. She only has space for 80 guests, so 40 cabins. For those of you who have been on a river cruise before, you will know that most of the river cruise ships in Europe are about 150 to 160 passengers. So it makes for a little bit more cozy environment. There's just 2 decks, a main deck and an upper deck. You get a little bit of a sense of the interior decor. It's sort of quite modern, contemporary, very French. The company that owns and operates the ship, CROISIEUROPE, is a French company. They're actually the oldest river cruise company in Europe. They've been around for about 60 years. So we're very proud to be working with them. It's exciting because it's a bit different, because this ship is operated for not only for the English-speaking market, but also for the European market. So you have a mix of people on board, of French, of German, which I think it also makes it a bit different. If you go on some of the other river cruises, you're dealing with only English-speaking people, with a lot of Americans, a lot of British and Australians and so on, which is fine, but it's nice to meet people who hail from this region or hail from other parts of Europe, and what I was saying before about becoming well connected. So it's a great environment on board the ship. You can see a shot of the cabins there, double and twin cabins available. The cabins are pretty much a standard size throughout both upper and main decks, the only difference being that the main deck cabins have large picture windows and the upper deck cabins have the French balconies with the sliding glass doors. Wonderful food on board. It's all French cuisine. So while we will get a chance here and there to sample some of the local cuisine, they pride themselves on their French cuisine. There's worse things, I think, certainly to have. And also important to note is that all of the beverages are included, except for anything that's super fancy like champagne or premium spirits. But all of your beers, wines, and so on are all included throughout the journey. So that's quite an added benefit, and they have a great selection of stuff as well. So the Elbe Princess, a wonderful vessel. It's a great way to have us spend the next 8 nights as we cruise down from Berlin to Prague. So let's continue on now with the itinerary and the voyage. The following day, so we'll have overnighted in port in Berlin, and then we'll disembark in the morning, first of all to visit Charlottenburg Palace, and later on in the afternoon to visit Sanssouci Palace. And both are incredible palaces. They are probably the largest and most extravagant palaces that we'll see on this whole trip. We'll see some other amazing buildings as well. And both of them, in particular, the Sanssouci Palace is kind of referred to often as the Versailles of Germany, except that Versailles, of course, was done more of a Baroque style, whereas this is a Rococo style of architecture. It was built by Frederick the Great. And unlike Charlottenburg, which we'll see in the morning, was completely destroyed, or almost completely destroyed during World War II. But Sanssouci, which is in the town of Potsdam, just outside of Berlin, remained mostly intact. So what we see today is the original building that was built back in the mid-18th century. So some magnificent landmarks that we'll take in right on the first day. We'll then head on down the canal towards Wusterwitz, the Havel River. So in this point, we're still navigating through the canals. And then sometime in that evening, we will go out of the canal system into the Elbe itself. And then the following morning, we'll arrive in Magdeburg. So Magdeburg is quite a beautiful city. It has a magnificent cathedral, which is known for housing the tomb of Otto the Great. And the city itself, the old part of the city, which is close to where we'll be mooring the ship and where we'll be walking around, really has some of the old European charm to it, that Gothic Baroque sort of style of architecture, so it's a lovely town to wander around in. A lot of the buildings around the town, though, still have that Soviet style of influence. So this is interesting too, because of course they had a very plain and efficient style of building in these square blocks. Not very pretty, but I think it's important to see that as well. And Magdeburg is certainly a mix of the old culture and the new culture from an architectural standpoint. But actually, what I think the most important thing about Magdeburg is, and from a sort of an engineering standpoint, is they have one of the world's only water bridges. So the so-called Rhine-Havel Canal was built back in the 90s as part of the reunification spending projects in Germany. They spent €500 million to build a canal, which is literally a bridge over the Havel River. So the ships can travel in this canal in a bridge over top of the Elbe River. And they did this so that ships traveling in more of a north to south direction into other parts of Western Germany would not have to descend down into the Elbe River and then back up again. So it was, I guess they figure, more time efficient for them to build this water bridge. Quite a remarkable feat. So we'll see that. We'll pass right underneath that. We'll be on the Elbe River, and the other ships will pass over top of us on the canal. So then the following day, we'll continue upstream on the Elbe River and heading into Wittenberg. Wittenberg is the home of Lutheranism. So I don't know how much you know about Martin Luther. I must confess, until I had first sort of explored a little bit of this region, I didn't know much about it. And unless you are sort of a specialist on a history and the history of Protestantism, you might not know much about Martin Luther, but he has quite an interesting story, because this guy back in the 15th century protested the Catholic Church's corrupt practices. Not that I'm suggesting that the Catholic Church has corrupt practices, but he certainly felt that way. And he wrote his famous 95 Theses, which he nailed to the wall of the Castle Church, which is today designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And largely his writings about what he believed was the purpose of the Bible and the purpose of the church really changed the course of religious history in Europe, and it paved the way for what we know as for the Protestant Reformation and what we know it as today's Protestant Church. And it's largely why I think Germany as a country is mostly Protestant, when the countries surrounding Germany are all largely Catholic. And so there's tons of references to Martin Luther around the town of Wittenberg. That's partly why it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They celebrated the 500th anniversary of his death just last year, actually. So we'll also get a chance to visit, as I say, this Castle Church where he nailed his theses to the door. So a lot of history in Wittenberg, and we'll spend a lovely day there, and obviously have time as well to explore a bit of the city on its own. And then we'll overnight, of course, on the ship as we make our way upriver, then sailing into the next morning into Meissen, and then later that day in Dresden. So Meissen, yet again, another beautiful city. You may or may not heard of this city. It's very picturesque, as you can see here. It has some very notable Gothic structures like the Albrechtsburg Castle, which is shown in the picture. But the most important thing about Meissen is its porcelain. And its porcelain industry was started way back 300 years ago. They took the clay right off the banks of the river. And it is some of the most highly prized porcelain anywhere in the world, and fetches, certainly the antique porcelain fetches incredible prices. We will have a chance to visit the factory and potentially even take home some of our own mice. It is not cheap, but it's quite a special thing to have Meissen porcelain. Later that afternoon, we'll head back for lunch on the ship, and then we'll arrive into Dresden. And Dresden, I got to tell you, is one of my favorite cities from an architectural standpoint, because the city has an interesting story, and you'll have some free time. But what you'll find, and I'll be quite honest about this, is that there's almost not enough time to take in this whole city in the roughly half day that we'll spend there. They call it the Florence of the Elbe, and it's because of the incredible buildings that were built there, again dating back hundreds and hundreds of years. But the sad thing is, as many of you will know who are familiar with the history, particularly of the world wars, Dresden was totally destroyed during World War II. The Americans came in and blitzed them in 1945, and then the British came in after that and blitzed them again, and the city was just about flattened. So all these magnificent buildings were all but completely destroyed. But during the course of the Soviet era, but even more so since reunification of Germany, they have managed to put some of these incredible buildings back together, like the Frauenkirche, the Frauen Church, the Sempra Opera House, the so-called Zwinger Royal Palace. So many beautiful buildings that represent really all forms of architecture. Again, your Baroque style, your Gothic, your Renaissance are all represented here in Germany, in Dresden, and the city is a testament to its very challenged history. They had literally 1.5 million refugees that lived here during the war period. They had some terrible war crimes that were perpetrated by the Nazis. So much happened in Dresden, and of course, because it was a major city in Eastern Germany, it was effectively not really in the tourist radar up until reunification, and even then it took a lot of restoration to make the city what it is today. And as I say, I find it truly glorious and one of the most important cities to visit in Europe. So we'll spend a great day there. We'll then continue upriver, heading then towards the Czech border into a region called Saxon Switzerland, Sächsische Schweiz in German. And of course, it's got nothing to do with Switzerland, but they named it that because of the beautiful rolling hills and the mountains, the sandstone mountains that we're going to see while we're passing through this region. They kind of look like the mini Dolomites. And the highlight of this particular part of the country where we cross from Germany into the Czech Republic is heading up to the KONIGSTEIN fortress, which sits about 240 meters above the river valley, and it has incredible views. So it's one of the most picturesque parts of the journey. The Elbe passes through a very narrow valley. You get a little bit of a sense of it from the picture here. But this fortress itself, which of course was a royal palace, a royal residence going back hundreds of years, but more recently in modern history, it was used as a POW camp during the wars, and then it was subsequently turned into a museum. And it's actually one of the most popular and sought after attractions in this whole part of Eastern Germany. About 500,000 people a year travel up to get these amazing views of the Elbe River. We'll head back onto our ship, and at this point we'll cross over into Czech Republic, and we'll sail down towards Ústí nad Labem, which will be our first overnight stop in the Czech Republic, and then only to arrive the next morning on our 10th day at LITOMERICE. So we're now in the Czech Republic. So this is a different language altogether, and I have to laugh because I always have to check my pronunciation of this. And I spent some time living in Prague and trying to properly pronounce all of the words. And so you see these funny letters like the E and the R with the accents above them. So LITOMERICE, it's a tricky one to pronounce. I'm not going to test you on this, is affectionately referred to as the Garden of Bohemia. I had actually never heard of the city. I'm guessing you probably wouldn't have heard of it before either. Even when I lived in Prague, it wasn't until after I moved away from there that I actually went up and explored this city. It's an amazing place. The area is a sort of a microclimate, which makes it a fruit and wine growing area. But the city itself is a mix of Gothic, Baroque, and Renaissance buildings, unlike just about any other city in the Czech Republic. And they have a lot of beautiful cities in the Czech Republic, but from a diversity of architecture, it really rivals Prague. So we'll also get a chance to sample some Czech wine here. Not something you often get to do. We certainly don't have many on the wine list at outlets in Canada. So you'll get to see a little bit about what Czech wine is all about as we spend our first day in the Czech Republic in LITOMERICE. From here, our ship continues down towards Prague, where we'll arrive on September the 17th. So that'll be our last full day on board the ship. And Prague for me is this very special meaning. I used to live there, and it is undoubtedly one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. our we'll disembark the ship actually a little bit before we arrive in Prague at a town called Kralupy. That's because the river winds quite a bit as the Elbe then splits into its tributary, the Vltava, or the Moldau in German, and then it will make its way into Prague. And in the meantime, we'll take a shortcut so that we can make the most out of our day in Prague. We'll start off at Staroměstské náměstí, the old town square, which is famous, of course, for the tin church, the dual-spired church. And of course, the astronomical clock with its figurines that come out every hour on the hour, and always hundreds of people gather to watch this amazing spectacle. Prague has so much to see. It is, people rave about it because unlike Dresden, it was largely untouched during the wars. So the buildings were mostly the original ones, and again, dating back literally 1,000 years in some cases. They talk about it as a city of 1,000 spires because when you look out from Prague Castle is the image that you see on the bottom picture. You can look out and see all of the different churches and palaces and other buildings that have these magnificent spires. So Prague really doesn't need any introduction. We'll obviously have a panoramic tour there where you'll get a chance to wander around the Old Town Square, and then you'll have time on your own. This is one of those days where a lot of people will head back for lunch on the ship because, of course, lunch on the ship is included. I would recommend, I'll probably hang around in town so we can sample a little bit of Czech fare. It might even be a sausage on the side of the road. They're famous for their sausage stands, among other things. But to spend as much time as we can wandering the streets of Prague, there's just so much to look up at, and it's fantastic. Well, we'll spend our final overnight on the ship. There'll be a gala dinner and then a show in the evening. And then the next day will be the day that we say goodbye to the Elbe Princess and our ship. For those of you who are flying back, there is either a direct flight with Air Canada Rouge flying between Prague and Toronto, failing which there are some good connections back to other parts of Canada through Frankfurt and Munich. For those of you who wish to continue on and spend a little bit more time in the Czech Republic, I can highly, highly recommend our short extension program to Karlovy, which will start this day, and we'll drive an hour and a half down to one of the most famous European spa towns. Karlovy, which is known as Karlsbad in Germany, is situated in the very western part of Bohemia, not far from the German border, and it's in a magnificent green forested valley, and once again has some of the fantastic architecture that, like what you see in Prague, but even more compact in this valley. It is truly a picturesque city and a wonderful, wonderful place to spend 3 days of rest and relaxation. So we'll have 3 nights in Karlovy, and our home during this time is going to be, well, let me tell you a little bit more about Karlovy first. I'm just noticing on the screen here. Karlovy, again, like so many of the cities in the Czech Republic, dating back a couple of hundred years, back to the 18th century. And again, it's known for it being a spa town. I think there's 13 hot springs here that provide the thermal waters that flow into so many of the hotels and spa facilities throughout the town, which makes it one of the most sought after spa towns in all of Europe. People come from not only all parts of Europe, but people come from Russia, from the Far East. And now we're going to get to come and try perhaps some of the thermal water, some of the wonderful spa treatments that they offer here. And there's no better place to stay in Karlovy than in the Grand Hotel PUPP. And this hotel, which is truly majestic. I mean, a picture does not hardly even do it justice, but it's a magnificent large hotel that has been home to royalty, politicians, sort of officials from all over the world over the years. It's a special place in my heart because it was the original hotel before the communist government took it over after the war. It used to be actually in my family. So every time I go back there, I feel this little twinge about this hotel because it's become so famous. The International Film Festival is is held here. One of them is held here at the Grand Hotel PUPP every year. But most famously in recent years, the James Bond film Casino Royale was filmed there. So now you're going to want to go back and call it up on Netflix and watch that film so you can see some very dramatic images as James Bond sort of flies down into this fabulous hotel. It has a magnificent grand cafe, which just sitting in a coffee you just don't want to leave, with its high ceilings and all wood and magnificent place. So we'll have 3 nights to enjoy this wonderful hotel. It has, of course, its own spa center, which is a separate facility from the hotel that one can avail themselves of, or one of the many other spa facilities that exist in the town. So it's a great way to end off the tour. And of course, then at the end on September the 21st will be the end of our program as we head back to the airport in Prague and head for home, or for those of you who might continue on to some other part of Czech Republic or somewhere else in Europe. So let me go through a few of the details of the program in terms of what it all entails and what's included here. So once again, September the 7th to the 21st of 2020. So we planned this well in advance. This ship is popular because it is the only one sailing on the Elbe River. And so we have to block our spaces well in advance. It's 11 nights on the main program plus 3 nights as the extension. And it comes in at $69.50 Canadian for the cruise portion, and only a modest $900 difference, or just under $1,000 for the extension program in Karlovy Vary. And what that all includes, as with most of our programs, at Wheel and Anchor, of course, our round trip airfare is included. Based on a Toronto departure, we can, of course, quote you if you're coming from other parts of Canada on what the additional airfare would be and the routing would be. Your accommodation in Berlin, of course, all your accommodation, meals, drinks, and so on board the ship. And they've got some, and all the excursions are included. So that's important to note. There's no extra shore excursions. They do offer some optional shore excursions that are not part of this program, but frankly, all of the ones that are necessary and that I would do are included in our program. And they have free Wi-Fi on the ship, which is also not, it doesn't happen all the time with many of the other companies. And of course, your host, which will be Cassandra, will be with you from the moment that you arrive in Berlin until you depart from Prague, and she will be taking very, very good care of you. She's gotten rave reviews from the group that she's been accompanying in Austria right now. So the question then is, what is not included? There's not much that's not included. Of course, sorry, let me cover just the inclusions of the extension program. Excuse me, I just got caught up for a second. So, of course, the extension program will include the transfers from Prague down to Karlovy Vary and back, your accommodation at the Grand Hotel with daily breakfast buffet, and then we'll have a special dinner there as well. That's included in that program. As I mentioned, not much that's not included. Of course, travel medical insurance and cancellation insurance, we strongly recommend. We can quote you on that. If you are coming from Canada, if there's any additional airfare that's involved, that would be in addition. And any of those optional tours, which I think are like mountain biking type programs, they're a little bit different than the main part of the program. If you'd like any information on those, we'll be happy to give those to you. But for the most part, as with most of our programs, everything is included, that you'll be well looked after on your way. So if you have any questions, we're going to get to the Q&A session. I see that a few questions came in during our webinar, and I will take a moment to address them now. But of course, you can reach us at any time by email at the number shown there, of course, by phone. We're always happy to hear from you, no matter how you want to get in touch with us. So let's now move to the question and answer session. So I see a couple of you have asked questions already. If anybody else has any questions, now is the time on the webinar. So I'll start off with Pauline from Edmonton asked about if there's a lot of walking on the tour. I would say there's a moderate amount of walking, Pauline. It's not an extraordinary amount. Generally, as a rule of thumb, I say that you should be able to walk up to about 1 kilometer without a break. As long as you can manage that. We don't have any super long walks, nor do we have any. All of these historical monuments in Europe, of course, have a lot of churches with a lot of stairs and so on. But of course, you don't always have to walk up to the top of the spire, which is an additional 100 or 200 steps that one doesn't need to do. But for the most part, I would say it's we call it moderately strenuous, this program. So as long as you're in fairly decent shape and you can walk up to a kilometer, you will be just fine. Then John asked if people speak a lot of English in these towns. Well, John, it's a good question. And, 25 years ago, you'd have had a tough time with the locals. But in the meantime, English is taught, of course, in Germany to kids from a very young age. And now in the Czech Republic as well. So other than folks that are getting up there, sort of over 50, 55 years old, in that case, they will often struggle with speaking English. But if you, I always say to people, if you seek out the young people, they will just about always speak enough English to help you out if you're in a tight situation. And of course, any shops and restaurants. The restaurants in Prague, it's interesting. When I first lived there, which is going back 10 years ago, a lot of restaurants, they did not speak English, or maybe they did, but they didn't want to. But things have changed a lot. The country has really progressed. You won't have a problem with the language. Teresa asked if we can extend our stay and where would we go? Yeah, I always encourage going and staying on a bit longer in any of our destinations, and we not only allow it, we encourage it. So if you are continuing on in Prague, if you have a couple different options. You could either stay in Prague itself, for those of you who've not visited Prague before, and I know a number of members have come and said, oh, they've been to Prague before, they've done it perhaps as part of a Danube cruise, but Prague is a place that people always like to go back to. But if you haven't had enough of it, you can absolutely stay some extra nights in Prague. I think that's a wonderful thing to do. Prague is well connected, particularly to the east. So you can arrive in Vienna, for example, in about 4.5 hours by train, and in Budapest, Hungary, in about 6.5 to 7 hours by train. Both of those cities, of course, part of the sort of the Golden Triangle, as it were, in the eastern part of Europe. So a lot of people will combine a program like this with spending a few days on their own in Vienna, Budapest. But likewise, from Prague, you have great air connections too. So you can just about go anywhere in Europe. In the Czech Republic, there's so many other great towns to visit. Český Krumlov down in the south. I could go on and on. But if you would like some advice on where else to go, we're happy to provide that for you. But certainly lots of options. And similarly, on the front end, if you wanted to arrive earlier in Berlin, because the 3 days that we'll spend there hardly does it justice, you are more than welcome to fly in early to take in a little bit more of Berlin. Tracy asked what the weather is going to be like. Well, this is mid-September. Frankly, the weather doesn't get better than at this time of the year. Typically, your days are going to be in the low to mid-20s. On occasion, it could be warmer. It could get up into the high 20s. But the evening is typically in the high teens. So it's about as good weather as you can get. It doesn't typically rain a ton, but it can rain from time to time in September, excuse me. So I wouldn't call it an overly wet period either. So weather is going to be just great, Tracy. There's nothing else to worry about. And I think that's it for the questions. But of course, if you have any other questions, do feel free to give us a call at any time, drop us an email. We always are happy to answer your questions. And it's been a pleasure hosting all of you this morning on our Elbe webinar. I hope you found it informative, and I do hope to see you soon. Of course, I'm in Calgary this evening, in Winnipeg tomorrow, and then back to Ontario for some events in Guelph and in Toronto. So if I don't catch you at one of those, then I'm sure I'll catch you at another event when I'm back from my spring tour season. So thank you very much for joining. Thanks for coming to the webinar today, and have yourselves a great day.